Boy, we're just about to complete our circle by calling on Dr. Farouk Mitha. Farouk is a lecturer at UVic. He's a curriculum developer with the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London, England, and a coordinator of secondary teacher education for the Aga Khan Development Network. His many publications include Al-Ghazali and the Ismailis. Please welcome Farouk.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Well, being the last speaker, I don't think I have anything to add. And that's a way to express my gratitude. You know, gratitude comes from the word grace. And the experience of grace today, of this harmony, of all of us being able to not only listen to each other's notes and music, but realize that we really get turned on by this sort of music. But I have a suspicion I'm speaking to the converted. And really, much of my talk is going to be much more about a call to vigilance. Because as much as we are all shocked that we have come to this state of affairs, what is more shocking is there's a lot of people who want this, and a lot of people who are supporting this. As a Ugandan refugee, I have seen how societies very quickly implode. So let us not be complacent. Even though we don't learn from history, we do get complacent very easily. And so, if I'm going to sound pessimistic, believe me, I'm not a pessimist, I'm an incurable optimist. But I think we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do. And I think the words that we use will have to be shared by those who don't agree with us. And exactly the type of radical hospitality will be with those people who would rather heckle and belittle this event. But we need that moment of encounter. Otherwise, I think we are going to go through the same old story of saying, you know, we should have known better. After the Second World War, we all just kept silent through the whole 60s scoop, and right to only recently coming to acknowledge what happened in Canada to the First Nations peoples. Anyway, you know, the gratitude I want to express is that having been a student of religious traditions, I've seen two perennial teachings. And these teachings I found in not only religious traditions, but even secular traditions. One is the golden rule. Treat others in the way you want to be treated, or variations of that norm. And that really is at the heart of all healing. Because it's when we recognize our interdependence, our reciprocity, our common humanity, that we realize that, look, we are really here in this very brief life together. And that is at the heart of what it means to be ethical. And the second teaching is know thyself, or self-realization. And that idea of a self that is not only biological, a self that transcends the physical, a self that is really much more greater than what we see in the mirror. And that is at the heart of all flourishing. It's this notion of knowing that we have infinite potential. And in that sense, I suppose, when we talk about this way of ethics and this way of spirituality, this is what makes us human. This is how we really, in a sense, define our common humanity. So having said that, let me just focus on, I think, two teachings that I've been reflecting on, coming from my tradition, and which I think is a challenge. And we need to say to ourselves, how do we bring this teaching alive? The first teaching is about choice. The difficulties of making the hard choices. There's a verse in the Quran, which is the Muslim scripture, and it says, indeed, Allah will not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves. Allah will not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves. This is about taking responsibility. This is about not finding someone to blame outside, but looking at ourselves in the mirror. And when we begin to enact this way of thinking, we are turning inwards, we are doing the hard work of self-examination, the more vital work of self-criticism. And I think this is what we're lacking today. When we see things happening, let us not ask, how did this come to be? But how have we all played a role? How are we all complicit? How have we all, in some way or another, made this possible? It's easy to avoid that question. It's very easy to turn away from that. But in one way, if we can find how we have contributed to this, it not only creates a sense of humility, but I think it begins to become something that becomes a form of an exemplar. I think that's what it means to be a moral exemplar. Not a holier-than-thou attitude, not this desire to point fingers, but to, in a sense, bear witness, to be compassionate. And very much compassionate with Donald J. Trump and the evangelical army that is behind it. Because if we are going to play the rules by his game, he's already won. If we are going to hate him, he's already won. Let our compassion be a source of triumph. And so, I think there's a lot of change to be done, and believe me, there's a lot of change that Muslim societies have to undergo themselves. The type of extremism that we're now seeing in American societies has been the real injustice that Muslims have been suffering in their own societies. The intolerant dogmatism that has hijacked Islam is a great tragedy. And the type of intolerant, extremist dogmatism that is hijacking most mainstream religions is the great tragedy. So how do we begin to look inwards? I think I should probably be a bit more humorous, sounding a bit more pessimistic to myself. So there's this wonderful fable, a set of fables by about Mullah Nasiruddin. He's a simple but lovable fellow, and there are stories about him throughout the Middle East, Iran, and Central Asia. And he always gets into trouble. And in the process of getting into trouble, we learn some wisdom. And as you know, without trouble, there are no stories. Every story needs some trouble. So maybe this is why we are going through this story at this time of our history. So one day, Mullah Nasiruddin was fast asleep in the morning. His neighbor wanted 4 donkeys to be taken over to the next village. So he knocks on Mullah Nasiruddin's door in the morning, and Mullah Nasiruddin gets up. And he says, yes, what's the matter? And the neighbor says, I'm really tied up today. I need this big favor. I need you to help me take these 4 donkeys to the next village. Mullah Nasiruddin says, sure, certainly, anything for you. He takes a shower, goes outside, and he looks at the 4 donkeys, and he ties 1, 2, and 3 donkeys, and then gets onto the 4th donkey. And then he heads out. And as he heads out, proud, knowing he's doing a good deed, everybody wishes him, salam, salam, how are you doing? What are you doing? He goes, oh, I'm transporting 4 donkeys of my neighbor to the other village. And he looks behind him, 1, 2, 3. He says, where's the 4th donkey? I left this morning with 4 donkeys. And he starts asking everybody, have you seen a stray donkey somewhere? I'm sure I had 4 donkeys. Rumor has it, Mullah Nasiruddin is still looking for the 4th donkey. Anyway, maybe you can interpret this story for me. But it really is about our inability to sometimes not look at ourselves. The second teaching that I have learned, again from a scripture from the Quran, and it says, and among Allah's signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the diversity of your languages and colors. Surely in these are signs for those who know. The term signs is the word ayat. Ayat also means a verse from the Quran, but there's a vision in the Quran that the universe is a text. And to read this text is to read Allah Himself. And this sense of oneness, to read all of Allah is to read the signs of Allah. But here he talks about difference being itself a sign, so that we may know it, so that we may know each other. Why do we fail in this? Why do we fail in this inability to be empathetic? This inability to enter into the shoes of the other. What is that source of failure? Have we not all failed in different ways? Whether it's when we hear a racist joke, when we are unable to see the panhandler in the eyes and we turn away, when we sometimes would rather not listen to bad news. But more importantly, when we see difference as a negative, when we see diversity as as a weakness, as a liability rather than a strength. And I only think that, what is the most curious thing for me is when we entered the digital world and we were so completely communicating with each other and so connected, it seemed, in a sense, inevitable that we will now no longer suffer ignorance. That we may know each other so well that in real time a teenager in Lahore can communicate with a teenager in New York. Stock traders can trade in real time no matter where they are. That we are somehow sharing each other's music on YouTube. That we are somehow sharing each other's culture. But the exact opposite has happened. Ignorance has grown. In fact, we are so now comfortable only hearing what we want to hear. Now that could be due to many things. Partly it's this idea of everything being a short attention span and there's no real sense of difference being encountered. It's just sound bites. But it tells me that, look, let's start honestly and say that, look, relationships take work, take hard work, and that living with difference is difficult. If we start there, maybe then there is hope. And let me end with a quote from Ibn Arabi, who was a poet mystic from the 13th century. And this idea of imagining difference, as I said, I wanted to focus on choice, and the second was imagining difference. And just listen to what he had to say. He came from Andalusia. We often talk about that period when the Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived in incredible, flourishing harmony. They influenced each other. The great Maimonides coming out from Andalusia, Thomas Aquinas being influenced. Now he may be a bit off the Christian tradition from which you come, but that was before Protestants were around. Being influenced by the Andalusian Muslim philosophers. And he talks here about his heart, and he tries to imagine his heart in a certain way. And so listen to what he has to say. My heart can take on any form, a meadow for gazelles, a cloister for monks, for the idol's sacred ground, Kaaba for the circling pilgrim, the tables of the Torah, the scrolls of the Quran. My creed is love. Wherever its caravan turns along the way, that is my belief, my faith. My creed is love. Thank you.